Everybody, welcome back to another episode of Dialing In for our Line 6 Helix. Today I'm taking a look at an effect, and one of the modulation effects that I've had actually quite a number of requests for over the last little while, and for some reason I've just never seemed to get to it, and that is the double take effect. So what is the double take effect? Well, it's an effect that the Line 6 folks put in, I believe, around firmware 2.3, so it's been out for a while, and it's so that we can give the effect of a doubled, tripled, quadrupled guitar tracks. So for any folks who aren't familiar with, studio work, let's say, one very common thing to do in the studio is to double or triple track guitars to get them sound nice and big and fat. Now there's a lot of ways to do this, a lot of techniques. One of my favorite things, and what I do on any of my productions if I'm working on an album or even doing session work for some folks, I will usually never go more than doubling the same part, but I always make sure to pan them, kind of whether they be hard left or right or really fairly wide out, so that they're kind of filling up the spectrum. Now, I'm a huge fan of actually playing the parts twice, and I get a lot of comments on that when I post a song of mine or whatever. People will ask me and they'll say, did you use a harmonizer if I'm doing a harmony, or did you use the double take? And the answer is usually no. If I'm in the studio, I would much rather play the part through twice, and there's good reason for that. And what I'm about to say is exactly why the folks at Line 6 made the double take, to try and kind of copy what I'm about to tell you. So the reason I like to actually play through the part twice and then pan them out is that no matter how good a player you are, no matter how proficient you are, no matter how great your timing is, you're never going to perform the same part precisely the same way in a number of ways. Timing. The timing's going to be slight drifts of maybe milliseconds, right? Maybe we're pressing a little harder on the strings and therefore bending the pitch micro cents out of tune with one another, which at first sounds like a bad thing, but it actually is what gives the character to it, and the fact that we're not copying the same thing. We're not robots, right? We play with different feel and different emotion all the time. So, putting these two imperfect parts together is what actually gives it its great sound. So we could maybe be playing dynamically different. Maybe we hit a little harder or a little softer in one of the takes. And all of those things kind of added together are what's going to give the character to this doubled take or this double track guitar. Now, in my personal opinion, and again, everybody can do whatever they want, and some folks might disagree with me, I find there's a point of diminishing returns after a couple of guitars where I just I've done it before where I've triple tracked or quadruple tracked in the studio, and I always end up just muting those tracks. I'm like, they're really not doing anything more for it now at this point. So, but again, your mileage may vary on that, and if you find that you love triple or quadruple track guitars, then by all means, I would say go for it if that's giving you the end result that you want. But again, I would play with like the panning and whatnot, so that they're not just kind of sitting on top of one another in the mix. But again, who knows? Maybe there's some cool effects there. So that's the kind of thing that the double take is attempting to create in the Helix in our preset without us having to go and do that. So, if I was in the studio, I'm never going to use this. But maybe live, if I want just that beefier, fatter tone, maybe I am going to kind of come after the double take a little bit. But to do so, we want to understand how it works. So let's go over to HX Edit and take a look at just that. All right, so here we are over at HX Edit, and I have my typical preset, template preset set up here. I've turned the delay off. We don't need any delay for this. And I threw a placator dirty in with a 412 greenback 25. The tone sounds basically like this. Good. Nothing wrong with that. Didn't really spend much time on it, but it's going to be good enough to get the point across. Okay, so let's go over to the double take. So first thing some folks might ask is, where should we place it, before the amp or after? Now, I gotta tell you, there's a mono and a stereo version of the double take. To me personally, I'm not even really going to look at it today, but a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about is, some of the stuff I'm going to talk about is still going to apply to it, but I would never use the mono version. It's going to start to kind of mimic more of just a normal, chorus modulation effect to my ears and in my estimation. And one of the things I love about double tracking guitars is panning them into different parts of the stereo spectrum to get that width and that beef. To me, that's where the magic lies. Not so much in just kind of laying them one over top of one another. So what's going to happen here, if I move the double take to the front of the amp, I'm basically going to lose my stereo effect from it, because what I'm doing now is I'm sending a mono signal into it. It's stereoizing that, and then I'm sending it into a mono amp. Now, I guess if I was using a dual cab where they were panned left and right, that might work, but I even think just hitting the mono amp before that is going to kind of negate the effect of the double take, right? And you'll see why this is important when I dive into some of the controls in here. So I like to put it after so we can take advantage of that stereoization of these doubles or triples or quadruples that we're going to do. So let's listen to the tone before again, and then I'm going to turn this on. These are the stock settings that come up with the double take when we just load it up. So here it is without. Here it is with it on. I don't know about you, but do you hear sort of a typical kind of modulation effect, almost a chorusing effect? And that's one of the things when I first pulled this up, when it first came out, I was kind of like, I'm not crazy about it. It doesn't, to me, sound like it's mimicking really doubling a guitar, but there's some controls in here, if we understand them, that can fix that for us. So we've got these two controls, slop and sensitivity. Then we have the number of doubles we're going to have. So I guess the number of extra tracks. So this would be sort of, I guess with one double, it would be our original track plus one, go to two, our original track plus two, our original track plus three, and all the way up to our original track plus four. To be quite honest with you, in my experimentation, I would probably never go beyond the two setting. But again, your mileage may vary. I'm not telling anybody what they can and can't do. We'll explore all of this. Slop to me, and I didn't really find any notes on this anywhere, so I'm just kind of going by what my ear is telling me. Slop to me sounds like how much variance it's going to have from the original part we're playing in both timing and I believe even a little bit in pitch, okay? So there seems to be variance in timing and pitch when we turn the slop up. The sensitivity to me seems like it's going to be kind of the width of that modulation, much like we would have in a chorus effect with a rate and a width, right? It's kind of similar to that in this. So, but doing slightly different things. So the sensitivity, and you'll hear when I play this for you, you will hear what I'm talking about. But for now, I'm going to turn this down, both of them to 0. The source is going to be set to mono because I am sending a mono source into it, okay? I haven't really messed around with using it with a stereo source going into it or a left versus right, but I guess depending on the complexity of our preset, we may need one of those settings. But for our sake, we're gonna go mono. Now, two of the most important controls in here are the dry level and wet level. So here's what I wanna do first. I wanna take the wet level completely out. Okay, we have everything kind of turned down. Now, here's the sound of the preset with this on, with just the dry level coming through. Now, do you notice something? If you're listening on headphones or on a set of speakers, all the sound went over to one side. What that's doing is, when we bring the wet level in now, watch what happens. Now I'm going to bring the dry level down and hear just the wet level. So on the other side is the wet level. So we can see with the setting of one double, on the doubles setting of 1, the dry level gets panned to one side and the wet level gets panned to the other. So this is great because this is going to give us that width that we want, right, in our sound. So when we put those two together at the same level, now obviously I've turned the slop and sensitivity down. Let's compare the two sounds. Off, on. I kind of almost like it like that because it just gives us this width without too much of this modulation. Okay, so what happens though if I go back to the dry level and I go to the double setting of 1, we have it on one side. If I go to the double setting of 2, watch what happens. Slight volume drop. If I pump that up to maybe 1.5, there's really no difference, as there shouldn't be. It's just kept us right up the center in mono. So you might say, well, why are they doing that? Well, to figure that out, let's do this. Bring the dry level down. Now let's listen to just the wet level. So we should have 2 copies of our original track. So what they've done, think about this. If we only have one double, we wouldn't want one to be up the center and one to be somewhere else. We want it to be a balanced stereo spectrum. So we would go one side with the dry, one side with the wet, do your little bit of modulation set by our slop and sensitivity, and then you're gonna get a more realistic doubling effect. But now when we go to 2 doubles, it's going to send, from what I can tell, our dry signal up the center and have 2 doubles out, each in different speakers. So here's our wet now. And then if I bring my dry level back in straight up the center, now to me that would allow me to then maybe mix more of my wet level, more or less of my wet level in. Now again, if I go to my dry level and go up to the number 3 on the double setting, we end up going all the way back to this side. Let's see what happens when we go with the wet level only. You can see how it's distributing these doubles and the dries across the stereo spectrum. So on setting 1, we have one side dry, one side wet. On 2 doubles, we have dry up the center, panned left and right somewhat. I don't know exactly how much, but it sounds pretty wide, out to the left. When we put 3 doubles, it pans our guitar back over to one side and then sort of places these doubles throughout the stereo spectrum. So if we add those together, again, and again, we can use our wet level. Thing about that though is if we go too little, then we end up with a really sort of panned out to one side sound. And what happens if we go back to our dry and we go to a 4 setting on the doubles? We're back up the center again. What happens on the wet? So they have basically all those doubles kind of spread throughout. Honestly, I am not crazy about the 3 or 4 settings for my use. I would probably never go much above 1 or 2. But now let's go to 1. Let's set the dry and wet about the same. And then we're going to slowly bring in the slop to hear what happens, okay? To really know what's happening here though, let's do this. Let's take our dry level out. Now we're gonna have all over to one side, but what you're gonna feel is almost some latency to the sound. Okay, because it's delaying that slightly later than the direct signal, and that's what's giving us our width when we go over here. So if we go back to slop on 0 and listen to only our wet, Doesn't feel like it has as much delay or latency. Now it's later. So it's really playing with the timing of it and moving it. Now the sensitivity is how much it's going to modulate that difference to give us different timing and possibly pitch effects. So if I set that slop to 10 and then put the sensitivity to 10, listen what happens. We get a lot of slop. Now, if I mix that in with the wet, you can hear it's varying the pitch, kind of randomizing in a sense the pitch and timing, right? To me, that just sounds like one good guitar player and one horrible player playing the part out of tune in various ways. So we'd want to be very careful with our sensitivity, but what you could do is start off with it, and I'm just keeping the slop on 10 just for the dramatic effect here, but start off with the sensitivity on 0. Now, even with that much sensitivity, we kind of hear some warbly chorusing, like dramatic chorusing type effects. So what I would say is, like, if you brought your slop back to 5 and your sensitivity down around 1.5 or so, it's really going to be up to us to decide how much of that kind of, wider modulation. I'm kind of partial to this sensitivity setting kind of lower. And maybe the slop setting down around there, 3F. Again with it off. Now the thing I would be careful about is using the wet level to blend here, because the problem is we're panned out kind of hard left and right. So if I bring my wet level down, we're going to lose sound out of one speaker or one ear. Maybe that's what you want, but just be aware that that's what's happening. So interesting stuff. Now where I would use my wet level to blend is if I had doubles on 2, because as we said before, the dry level is now going to be more up the middle. So I could possibly get away with maybe a little more slop, maybe a little more sensitivity, and just blend this in. There's with it off, straight mono. If I went up to 4 on the doubles. Again, I'm really not crazy with it once we get past the 2 on the doubles. So if we're on a setting of 1 on the doubles, I would want to probably have the dry and wet level more closely matched, unless of course we want one speaker or one side of the stereo spectrum louder or softer. And if we're on doubles on 2, then we can actually kind of use that as a blend control to take in more or less of the effective signal. It'll also give the effect of a more center forward sound, simply because the dry level coming up the middle is going to be a little bit louder, but you can play around with that, you know. So what would some of my favorite settings be on this? Quite honestly, I could see myself keeping the dry and wet level the same, going to 1 on the doubles, and then maybe like 3 to 4 on slop, and maybe like 1 on sensitivity, which would give us this. Versus off. To me, it sounds a little more natural that way. And again, everybody might like a little more. You might go up a bit with the sensitivity. Maybe even match the sensitivity in the slop. So that's my kind of take on the double take. So I hope that kind of helps you to understand a little bit more what those controls are actually doing. And I think that's the really important part here. It's not for me so much to tell you, these are the settings you should always use. Don't argue with me. These are the best. I don't have the authority to tell you that. Everybody's needs are different, right? I know some folks in the YouTube comments are always think that they've got everything figured out and they tell everybody how they have to do things and how everything I've done in it is wrong, which is always pretty hilarious. But I never try to do that, as you guys know that follow my channel. I think the important thing is I try to lay out what each control does so you can hear what it does. You can get almost instinctive at using that particular control before you've even moved it, because you know what it does now, right? And then you can have a sound in your head that you can go after and access and create much faster. And it's all about, as I've said before, workflow for me. I want things to just keep flowing. I want to get back to playing guitar, making music, not turning knobs to create a sound. I have that sound in my head. I want to be able to get it out of my unit that much faster. So I hope that was useful. I know there's some other uses, like I said, the mono version, and you know, I didn't want to go into this video for 2 hours here, but I think that gives us enough to kind of know what those controls are doing and what you might prefer for your uses with it. So thanks so much for tuning in, guys. I hope that was of use. I hope that was educational in some way, and I hope it opened up some possibilities for you and your tones. Please like the video, share it with anybody who you think would get use out of it, subscribe to the channel, and hit the little bell notification to get notified when I put new content out. I'll be back really soon. Thank you guys again so much for tuning in and your support and kind comments in previous videos. It's really, really appreciated. Thank you guys. Ciao for now.